our trailblazers with the experiences of this past decade. By the time I started writing, the path to publishing lesbian fiction was wide and relatively smooth. Thanks to a number of writers we've met here at GCLS, people like Melissa Good, Susan Maher, T. Novin, and Lori Lake. I was part of that bandwagon wave of writers that came to the world of lesbian books by way of Xena fan fiction. One of the show's many extraordinary gifts was the promise that Xena and Gabrielle would be entwined through the ages, rediscovering one another in all their future lives. For the storytellers among us, the possibilities for how that might happen were endless. Just ask Mavis Applewater, who wrote nearly 200 tales for her Wednesday afternoon series of PWPs. If you're unfamiliar with that acronym, it stands for Plot What Plot? We look forward each Wednesday to Mavis's new installments. They gave a whole new meaning to Hump Day. Together, the Xenoverse writers posted thousands of free stories at our favorite sites like Tom's Fan Fiction, Mary D's, the Athenaeum, and the Royal Academy of Bards. We were prolific because we were powered by the rocket fuel of reader feedback. We didn't have to wait 2 or 3 months for a publisher to reply to our efforts. Our jury came back within hours, nearly always with effusive thanks and praise. The more we wrote, the more they wanted, and it made for a very exciting trail. It bears mentioning that we were also prolific because many of us didn't concern ourselves with inconveniences like grammar, point of view, character arcs, or any other rigors of the craft. We wrote our stories as best we could, often mimicking the styles and cliches of other Xenoverse authors. And then we passed our work on to our friends for beta reading, which generally meant scanning for typos and occasionally offering a suggestion or two. There really wasn't much there to slow the creative process. As the Xena community flourished, so too did its fanfiction community. Independent of the TV show and its more formal marketing structures, readers and writers began to congregate on internet sites and at our own conventions where we gathered to celebrate our stories. Along the way, we found friends and lovers. I didn't find any lovers, I just found friends. We raised money for charity, lots of it. And we supported one another at times of financial and emotional need. Whether you were a writer, a graphic artist, a web designer, or a reader, you had a place, a valuable place in this community. All the parts worked together in perfect synchrony, and it was one of the most amazing social phenomena I've ever witnessed. I sometimes get an aching nostalgia for those Xenoverse heydays. And I feel privileged beyond words to have been a part of it and with so many of you. The formula of writers plus readers plus entrepreneurs took our brand of fan fiction to the next level, the commercial level, where desktop publishing, print on demand, and self-publishing avenues promised to turn virtually any of us into a published author overnight. Niche presses could produce books with very little capital investment, which meant the lesbian book market was suddenly flooded with a plethora of tales about a tall, dark-haired woman with azure eyes and strong cheekbones, and her petite blonde companion with emerald orbs and fabulous abs. I think it's fair to say the quality of these books varied greatly. And it took book buyers a while to sort out the chaos. To be honest, taking money for what we did didn't make us professionals. Still, the stories were precious to us, and they remain among our all-time favorites. They kept the magic alive after the show ended, and more importantly, they held us together as a community. No GCLS keynote address would be complete without a horror story about a publishing experience. I can tell you about my first time around the block, but all the details have been redacted thanks to a non-disclosure agreement. In hindsight, I believe we had too high expectations for our novice publishers, many of whom had even less experience at publishing than we had as authors. Most were undercapitalized and poorly positioned to edit, promote, and distribute our work, and quite a few of them have since folded. Does anyone know the difference between a publisher and a terrorist? You can sometimes negotiate with a terrorist. I was lucky to recover the rights to my first 2 books, Shaken and Malicious Pursuit, as that enabled me to then try self-publishing. Those details I can share, and while my experience may not fully qualify as a horror story, it certainly earned me some credits at the School of Hard Knocks. I thought self-publishing would work for me because what I wanted most was control. I liked working with an editor, but I hated being strong-armed into making changes I didn't want to make. I was aware, though, and very concerned about the stigma associated with self-publishing. The perception that such books weren't good enough to attract a publisher's investment. I was determined, as I'm sure we all are, that my books would be among the very best out there. The first thing I did as a self-published author was to put out second editions of the 2 books that had previously been released, gleefully undoing all of the demoralizing revisions I felt had been forced upon me. I then contracted with the aforementioned Cindy Creasap to work with me on the other novels from my online backlist. She had edited a number of successful books that I had personally enjoyed, titles like Teopa I Found My Heart in San Francisco, and The Bluest Eyes in Texas, and I was thrilled when she agreed to take me on. While it was true that I now had total control of my books, I also had total responsibility. The blurb, the cover art, the formatting, the print runs, the marketing and promotion, and the distribution. It reminded me of when I first started my research consulting business. I was trained in study design and statistical analysis, but the bulk of my time was eaten up with things like hustling business, accounting, payroll, and contracts, none of which were fun. Self-publishing was a lot like that. Writing was my bliss, but I didn't have as much time to do it. Yes, it paid better. At least the margins were higher. However, there was a cost to not being as productive. Then the first shoe dropped. I began to notice that my checks from the distributor were almost always accompanied by a note that said stock was running low. That meant the check I was holding would ultimately end up back in the printer's hands to pay for a second run. The second shoe followed, and I began to suspect this might be a centipede who would be at home in Karen Callmaker's closet. The second run didn't sell as quickly as the first, which meant my profits from the first run were tied up in a slow-moving inventory. I figured I could counter that by turning out books at a quicker clip. Within a year, I released The House on Sandstone and in a very limited run, Mulligan. In hindsight, I think both of those books would have benefited from another editorial pass and a line edit. The third shoe was the most frustrating. My distribution was largely limited to Starcrossed and Amazon, and the ceiling on sales came very quickly. Just because Barnes & Noble could special order my book didn't mean they offered it to their customers. Nor did Borders, Books A Million, or for that matter, many of the independent bookstores that still dot most of our major cities. Getting shelf space in the bookstore meant working the phones with their book buyers. Just what I needed, something else to do. The fourth shoe was the most devastating. As I mentioned, I had all the control and all the responsibility. I also had all the financial risk. You may not believe this, but not everyone in this business pays their bills. Shocking, I know. There was a distributor based in Sacramento called The Open Book. Some people just cringed inside, I know. They not only sold books in their store and online, they also serviced brick and mortar accounts for some of the lesbian and gay specialty stores. All of us who had books placed there for distribution got a rude awakening one day when, out of the blue, we received an email saying they were closing their doors. Too many bills and not enough cash flow. With shameless gall, they thanked us for our investment in their failed business, which meant we sold several boxes of your books, but we're not giving you any of the money. The House on Sandstone was their top-selling book that week. Around that time, Deborah Butler